Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 43 of Truth is Justice. At the end of last week's episode, I spoke about the wording used on Christian's tombstone. As a reminder, the words were as follows. In the end, it's not the years in your life that count, it's the life in your years. Christian Shane Andriakier. November 4th, 1992 to February 26th, 2014. Loving and loyal brother and friend, challenging and cherished son. Obviously, the part that I find difficult to comprehend is the final line. Challenging and cherished son. The cherished is clear, but challenging though? As I indicated at the end of the last episode, I've thought about that a lot, and I don't see a circumstance where that can be read in a positive way, especially when you try to match it up with the combination of the word cherished. And by that I mean, you can say that someone is always up for a challenge. I would even describe myself as that. I enjoy challenging myself and undertaking challenges, but I wouldn't use the word challenging to describe that about myself, and others certainly wouldn't attempt to describe my ambition or my drive or my passion for adventure, my tenacity, etc. They wouldn't use those characteristics I think I possess in describing me as a challenging friend or a challenging family member, or almost incomprehensibly a challenging son. So to explain my interpretation a little bit more, challenging just doesn't fit with the context of cherished, and we know it is attached to Christian's parents because of the word son being attached, so it's absolutely intended to be attributed to the feelings of his parents and the way they viewed Christian as a son. And there were many comments on our Facebook page about that line, and it seems that many of you, like me, struggle to see an interpretation of that is at all positive. There were several comments which suggested the importance of not reading too much into the use of that word. Now, whilst I agree with that to a point with respect to some interpretations of wording, I think that the wording which represents an eternal memory of Christian and presumably would have had significant thought go into it is actually something that goes very much to the heart of this case, being the relationship between Christian and his parents. Christian's prolonged strained relationship with his parents, particularly his mother, is documented clearly in the phone messages and notes, and we'll get into those in detail in another episode, but this is the first clear indication that I've seen, verifiable and confirmed indication from outside those text messages and notes, something presumably, and I think it's a safe assumption, something that was written by and authorised for engraving by Christian's parents themselves, that perhaps the relationship was genuinely strained between Christian and his mother and father. Now, there are several reasons why that is important, but one that immediately stands out is something I touched on last week. Christian made the choice to spend time with Whitley, Dylan, and their families. He clearly enjoyed their company, and we heard directly from Whitley's mother about the times she spent with Christian, memorable times that she reflected on fondly. Now, if you wanted to speculate, you could say that something the messages and notes found on Christian's phone don't do is suggest any difficulty at all with Whitley's family. So think about this. When Whitley, Dylan and their families are mercilessly attacked over this matter and there is a sustained and in many ways vicious campaign against them, as I said last week, it's an absolute slap in the face to Christian. So what is behind it? what is generating this level of animosity, which certainly doesn't appear to be reciprocated. But I do think those being attacked would have an entitlement to respond. So what is it? Is it resentment and anger that is perhaps reflecting the internal pain and regret that Ray may feel towards her relationship with her son, or the way she remembers him? Now, it's just a thought, but I think an entirely valid one to consider, because to relentlessly campaign against Christian's friends and the people he had expressed his desire to spend the rest of his life with is, in my opinion, a terrible way to honour his memory. We were provided with an insight into Christian's life through Culpable's visits to the Andriacchio family home, and we were walked through all the elements of his room, the bike, the street sign, etc. And cherished memories were shared about the type of home life it is suggested that he would have been able to lead. We were even told about how the family dog excitedly greets guests in a way that is entirely consistent with the suggested openness and welcoming nature of the family. What we don't see, and what seems to have been very carefully avoided, is anything that would suggest that the family is capable of everything that I've seen since first announcing that we were going to look at this matter. From the legal threats thrown at us within hours before even the slightest indication of how we were going to present this case, just the reputation we have for seeking and pushing for the truth and for honesty, to the entirely vicious personal attacks that are being made on people and even suggestions that physical violence would be warranted. No, we were shown a patient, nice, friendly family who have been let down and are graciously seeking the support of people to right a wrong. A family seeking as much attention as possible on a matter they believe has not been given the right attention previously. We do not see described a family willing to play the types of games that I believe we are now seeing. And they are games. They're vicious, spiteful games against people just asking questions like they wanted people to do, except people that are arriving at different answers to what the family wanted. The challenging son. Words that would no doubt be very carefully selected, and words that would have taken a long time to settle on. Words attributed to the way Christian's parents saw their son. Words eternally used to describe Christian as a challenging son. I can see only one interpretation of it, and I think that is truly heartbreaking. Ray has been especially outspoken on the death of Christian. I'm not sure how many hours of interviews she's conducted or how many times she has spoken to various podcasters about the matter on so many different elements of the case. So many different elements except that wording. And that is truly intriguing. Now, why, if the interpretation is somehow horribly misunderstood, or it's the result of a terrible error by the engravers that somehow passed through final checks? Anything, but we haven't heard a word on it. Now, I'll come back to further examples, but over the last week I've sat back a few times and thought that Ray must really feel like she can say anything, and people will find an angle to make it supportive, including challenging the practical usage of the English language. When people do that, you can all but guarantee that overly speculative, bordering irrational ideas, narratives and interpretations will be offered up in support of a position of murder, and the supporters of it will find ways to defend it. It is so incredibly sad, and that it is being done in some way to honour Christian's memory is appalling. And many of you that listen to Culpable would be familiar with the opening stock comments about suicide prevention. Now, after the first one or two listens, I didn't really absorb what they were saying. Now, I don't want that to happen here. So, rather than read from the same script or play the same piece of audio every week about the importance of calling a hotline if you are having suicidal thoughts or feeling depressed, I wanted to do something unique each week, something that you will actually absorb. Now, will that be any more effective than a standard script like that employed by Culpable? I don't know. Maybe not. But for the sake of a little bit of time, and given the seriousness of the topic, I think it's worth a shot. So, first a reminder that we are covering very difficult topics here. We're talking about matters that will have the potential to trigger negative emotions. More broadly, our Facebook page discussions and those related to truth is justice are at times very graphic and confronting. Now, if that triggers anything negative for you, or you can't participate in those discussions or listen to this podcast without getting upset, please don't. Switch off and leave our group. Next, I talked last week about how I really don't have any authority to talk about suicide or depression. I genuinely feel That should only be a topic spoken about in detail by those who have been formally educated and have significant experience in it. What I will do, though, is share some of my experiences over the last few weeks. If nothing else, it's different to a stock referral to telephone numbers that I suspect most people would not even hear after the first few times. So, as many of you on Facebook know, I've spent the last few weeks in the mountains, some skiing and hiking and occasionally recording videos to prove that I exist. But what's hit me quite powerfully is the way in which my emotions can be dramatically changed by slight shifts in my perception of things and of certain circumstances. I don't even know, in some instances, what the changed perception was as a result of. It was obviously that subconscious, yet it could be so powerful. So, if you're listening to this and you can't look at the future with hope or see paths ahead which make you want to get up in the morning and passionately attack life, please contact the suicide and depression hotlines in your country. Now, I'll put the phone numbers of those groups in the US, the UK and Australia in the show notes, and we'll do that from now on whilst we continue our coverage of this matter. So if something that I can't really even put my finger on could change my emotions in such a powerful way, and really pretty dramatically change the way I see life, then imagine what someone who is specialised in understanding emotions and helping people find a path forward can do for you. There is hope, and there are people that can change the way you see life. It's worth it. It is worth at least giving it a chance, so please do. During the Melgar season, we noticed how once a claimed position supporting a narrative where Sandra was innocent of murdering Jaime became disputed, not just disputed, comprehensively debunked through a careful and objective analysis of the evidence, the explanations made to try and support that narrative became increasingly bizarre. The manicured nails are a perfect example. Once photos demonstrated that they were not perfectly manicured, the explanation was given that Sandra would regularly work in the garden and that she kept her nails the best she could. In fact, it was said that because of her arthritis, it was difficult for her to keep them at their best, so perfectly manicured nails was correct relative to Sandra. And try and wrap your head around that attempt at spin. But, of course, that explanation is in conflict with claims that Sandra was reliant on her cane and could barely leave the bed some days. So then, the gardening narrative had to be further propped up. So it went from Sandra regularly working in the garden to being passionate about gardening, but unfortunately only being able to garden at those times when she felt well enough and her conditions allowed her to. The changes in the narrative and the way supporters of Sandra's would twist and adapt a story to fit was entirely predictable. And I suggest that we are seeing exactly the same thing with different elements of this matter, and how the supporters of a narrative aligning with a scenario where Christian was murdered defend an interpretation or that narrative through any spin on the facts possible. Take, for example, the blood on Christian's right hand. This is something that is, I strongly feel, hugely important in understanding what happened in the bathroom that day. Seamlessly, shamelessly, the position changes from presenting as fact the position that there was no blood on Christian's right hand, presenting that as fact multiple times, to explaining why there is indeed blood on Christian's right hand. And make no mistake, no blood on Christian's right hand is indeed huge, if it were true. If there was indeed no blood on his right hand, it would suggest that something interfered with the blood spatter landing on his hand, and that raises different questions. So no wonder the claimed lack of blood on his right hand has been presented as fact by Ray so many times. But predictably, those claims follow a well-worn path once the main claim is debunked, which it has been. Now, if you haven't been part of the discussions on our Facebook page, I'll explain. I shared an image on Facebook last week which highlights the blood spatter micro droplets on Christian's right hand. Now, as was done with the image of the location of the entry wound, the image was filtered through Photoshop to ensure it was as removed from a raw autopsy image as was possible. Now, I'll place that image up on our website in the coming days for those of you that are not members of our Facebook page. It's important to note that I didn't undertake that analysis of the autopsy image and identify the blood spatter. People with a trained eye were kind enough to do that for me. Now, if you want to understand why I'm not going to name the people or the group that did that analysis for me, well, go back and listen to last week's episode 42. It explains why. If the lack of identification of the source troubles you, then there isn't much I can do about that. even if I did provide the full details of who and how that analysis was performed, you would find an angle to dispute it. The important thing is, Christian's right hand most certainly has blood spatter on it, in the regions I believe that you would expect to find it, and not find it if Christian were to have been holding the gun when it was fired. The coverage of the micro droplets is broad, with significant areas towards the wrist area of the back of Christian's right hand. Now, I believe the blood spatter on Christian's right hand is almost fatal to the murder narrative for a number of reasons. And this is why I believe the Andriaco family have continued the no blood on Christian's right hand story for so long. So Christian was right-handed and would presumably have tried to interact with an attacker physically in some way if he were being threatened with a loaded gun. He would have likely used his right hand if his hand were free. Now this is where the blood spatter is important. Christian's right hand must have been very near the vicinity of the entry wound when the shot was fired for the blood spatter to have been found in the areas on his hand that it was. So that is the first indication that it wasn't restrained, that his right hand wasn't restrained in any way. If his hand were to have been restrained in any way, we would see some sort of interference with the coverage of the blood spatter. So imagine holding someone's hand and then splashing something like paint over both your hands. The area where you are holding the other person's hand will be protected from that initial splash because your hand blocked it. We do not see that type of interference at all. I suggest to you, and this will make more sense when you look at the image, there is no physical way Christian's hand could have been restrained in an area in close proximity to the entry wound when the gun was fired, given the blood spatter coverage. So that would leave a scenario where Christian was, through some means other than physical restraint, forced to hold the gun against his temple entirely against his will. I think the explanations for that are extremely limited, to the point of being virtually non-existent. Of course, these results have been challenged in various ways. One being that the blood spatter identified was not actually blood spatter, but blemishes on Christian's skin or some type of debris other than blood. Now, I entirely reject that conclusion, and I'll offer up this as a response to those claims. The Andriaco family have not offered up a single piece of blood pattern analysis of Christian's right hand to support their claims of there being no blood on his right hand. When experts, albeit experts with questionable backgrounds, when experts in various fields have been commissioned to do work for the family, it would seem logical to present material on something as telling as the right hand that was holding the weapon. Now, another angle used to dispute the blood spatter is the claim that since the medical examiner didn't make mention of the blood spatter, there must not have been any blood spatter. And this is where consistency again becomes a huge problem. So we see that there is both the claim that the medical examiner was incompetent and lacking in various fundamental ways, but the argument is also presented that the medical examiner's lack of notation of blood spatter on Christian's right hand is an element that would simply not have been missed, so thorough work on the part of the medical examiner. So you can see the glaring problem with that. You simply can't have it both ways. Now, if you're in need of a laugh, I'd highly recommend going over to Reddit and looking up the Culpable Podcast subreddit. I don't say it's funny to be disrespectful, but there is some serious tin hat conspiracy stuff going on there that will either give you a laugh or make you question reality as you know it. There are suggestions that somehow we have the inside word from the Department of Justice on some upcoming decisions on this matter. Now, if you believe that we wield that much influence, I'm truly flattered. I'm not going to try and convince you otherwise because clearly nothing I've said up to this point has made any difference, so no further clarification is going to do anything. But for those of you that read some of that and get a laugh, it has really made me recognise why some of the true crime podcasts that push conspiracy narratives are so lucrative. They are reaching out to the belief that some people, actually quite a few people have, that there is a cover-up and conspiracy at every turn. And they're validating that in a way that's massively important to those people, and accordingly, very financially valuable to those willing to do it. So some have taken the view that Whitley and Dillon are entirely guilty simply because they haven't yet spoken in public about the incident, and specifically are not screaming about their innocence on Truth is Justice. And that's a ridiculous position to take for various reasons. there is literally nothing to gain for Whitley or Dillon commenting at all on this matter. Nothing. Think about it. If they offered up the same commentary as they did in their formal statements shortly after Christian's death, supporters of a murder narrative would say they are just continuing to lie. If they offered up even a minutely different commentary on a tiny point, no matter how small, supporters of a murder narrative would claim that that's an indication that they were deceitful originally. In fact, absolutely nothing they could offer would be of any benefit to them at all. If they have legal counsel, I would imagine they have been advised, as any decent counsel would do, to not speak about the matter at all. If you want to understand that in a different context, jump on over to Bob's page and ask the thoughts from some of those people about whether an individual should ever speak to investigators. You'll hear a resounding never. In fact, I think that point was made loudly by Bob multiple times during the season. Now, whilst that fits neatly with the wrongful conviction stance, it doesn't fit so neatly with those same groups attributing guilt to those they have recklessly labelled alternate suspects who refuse to speak to them. Again, it's all about perspective and consistency. Some of you may be aware of the multiple Reddit posts about truth is justice and some commentary on the case which is, at times, difficult to identify whether it is intending to be serious or not. I won't make a habit of addressing those claims. Many are just too off the wall, but some deserve to be mentioned. So someone suggested that I'm too heavily invested in Whitley and Dillon's innocence to look at this case objectively. Now, honestly, I have no idea what the basis for that comment is. Those of you on our Facebook page will know where I am at the moment. I'm literally up in the mountains and I'm having a nice peaceful time. Well, it's raining ice and it's going to take some effort to make the audio okay, but still, I'm in a good place. I couldn't be any less invested in any one position, any less invested in anything other than getting to the truth. And that is not meant to be disrespectful to anyone involved in this matter, but it is the absolute truth. Not being invested, though, doesn't mean that I'm going to be convinced by truly ridiculous claims, as some people seem to be. I read something on the culpable Reddit thread earlier that even suggested if you listen to the 911 call carefully, you can hear people, and they're referred to by the Redditor as enablers. Well, it suggested that if you listen closely, you can hear these enablers interfering with, and presumably meaning staging, the crime scene. Now that is truly next level rubbish, up there with Bob's headlight analysis. Whilst it's one thing for an individual to claim that elements of a call may be unusual, I'll draw your attention back to the definitive claims made by Mr. Martinez that were formed entirely without a formal analysis. That's different to the claim that you can hear staging, which is quite an extreme talent, to put it mildly. It's honestly one of the most ridiculous things I've heard on this case, yet it's presented as being plausible. Now, even if you were somehow able to ascertain from background noise that enablers were staging a suicide, a task I would suggest is impossible, think about all the problems that narrative then causes with the general murder scenario. So we then need to accept that these enablers were so rushed that they staged the scene not prior to, but literally whilst the 911 call was being made, and that is after claims that Christian had died many hours earlier. It would need to assume that these enablers waited for several hours, if you accept the hugely speculative suggestions of Christian's time of death, that they waited for several hours before kicking into gear within minutes of the police arriving, even employing delaying tactics during the call, as some have claimed, rather than simply waiting to phone 911 until everything was ready. So, we have so many problems with it, fatal flaws, yet people still see that as the most reasonable conclusion. It's unbelievable, really. Incredibly, there are ongoing claims by some of the people closest to this matter that our decision to begin our coverage without completing a FOIA and instead relying on access to the material through other means has compromised our position. Now, there are several important reasons why the source of the case material is largely irrelevant with respect to those claims that we have begun looking at this matter with a particular bias. Now, first, the assertion made by some of those who believe Christian was murdered is that the case material is being intentionally altered by those individuals who have the responsibility for distributing the case material. The claim, as I understand it, is that material which confirms murder is being withheld by that person or persons when distributing the material so as to present a file that is swayed towards suicide. Now, that's an unusual claim to make because presumably it would be simple for those with access to so-called definitive material to write that, but with respect to the suggestion that we should have obtained the case material through a FOIA request, no FOIA request would be legitimate under those claims, meaning a FOIA request would apparently be at least as compromised as receiving the material from any other source. And second, the nature of the suggestion that the case material that has been formally distributed is incomplete or altered in some way is able to be argued regardless of the source of the material, for the reason that no specific examples are provided about what has been altered or what is missing. It can always be argued that something is deficient if you offer up no specifics on exactly how it is deficient. Saying that you have proof without offering up even a hint at the said proof, as we have seen from the Andriacchio family, is misleading at best. Third, if the case material was obtained under a FOIA request, it could be argued, by anyone that disagrees with any of our conclusions, that we at Truth is Justice received a complete case file, but made the decision ourselves to withhold specific documents or to undertake the alteration of specific documents. There would be no way for us to suitably address those claims to those people that assert them. Fourth, multiple posts have been made on our Facebook page requesting anyone with any case material that they believe is missing from the released case file to provide it to us for publishing. As of now, no material has been provided to us in response to those posts. We have published a number of pieces of material, including the so-called secret tape, that, whilst not neatly categorised as being a part of the evidentiary material, any more so than, say, an image of Christian's grave, has now been made widely available for people to arrive at their own decisions on. The withholding claims persist, but without evidence to support them. And fifth, I honestly can't think of a better way to prove a cover-up or corruption by the state or the deliberate manipulation of the case material that has been released other than highlighting on our page or off our page the specific discrepancies using a standard release set of the FOIA material. In that respect, our coverage of this matter and our public sharing of the case material should provide a perfect public opportunity for individuals to demonstrate exactly how this matter is being handled with deceit by both the state and those closest to the case. Instead, what we see are almost childish and entirely vague assertions that the distribution has proven something. What that is anyone's guess. Again, what an ideal opportunity it would be to show it, if it actually was true. Now finally, I wanted to set the record straight on my position with respect to Bob Ruff and his show, specifically the absurd claims that I'm somewhat resentful or bitter and that Truth is Justice is all about seeking my revenge. Now that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, in many ways, I should have some amount of gratitude to Bob for setting me on the path to create Truth is Justice and start the podcast. Aside from the benefits becoming comfortable with listening to your own voice have in life in general, I've met some very interesting people and made a number of friendships that will long outlast this podcast and the Truth is Justice project as a whole, and I'm very grateful for that. See, everything is about perspective. Many of you will recall how Bob took aim at the crime scene investigator Mr. Carpenter during his coverage of the Melgar case. It reached truly ridiculous levels. There were memes about Mr. Carpenter. Bob was mocking him mercilessly on the show, and even the production of clothing that included catchphrases that Bob would throw out about Mr. Carpenter. Now, for those of you that are not familiar, Mr. Carpenter's main contribution to the case, as Bob portrayed it, was as a photographer of the crime scene. And to put in context the suggestions by Bob that Mr. Carpenter's capturing of the scene was subpar and abysmal, over 1,000 photographs were taken of the scene, and a walk-through video of the crime scene was prepared. Yet, Mr. Carpenter copped a level of criticism that seemed entirely irrational. So, if you wanted to look at bitterness and resentment, you could easily apply that to Bob's somewhat bizarre obsession with Mr. Carpenter. Yet, it is easier when I point out all the ways in which Bob is taking advantage of the victim of a crime and taking advantage of his audience to make money through lies, deceit, and manipulation. It's easier for some people just to disregard that and claim some other basis. Now, if we're able to do one thing here, I'd love it to be that it's to strongly encourage you to look at things rationally and objectively. Consider the facts, consider the evidence, and be sceptical of definitive claims that are made when the evidence underlying them is kept secret. Along those lines, I'm sure that many of you are aware of the claims now being made that Gun Night was supposedly a gathering of assassins waiting for Christian to arrive, or something like that. And not only do those claims have no support from the evidence actually appears to entirely contradict those claims. It entirely debunks those claims. We will explain all the reasons why on next week's episode, but it does make you wonder whether these ridiculous, obviously fictitious claims are being thrown out there because of a lack of understanding of the case material, which I think there's some basis to believe may be true, and I'll expand on that next week, or whether it is done knowing there is no basis in reality and it's simply a way to keep the campaign alive. Who knows? But I can assure you, as each fictitious claim is made, we will set the record straight. And the same will be done for each of the claims that have been made in the past that in many ways entirely form the basis for these narratives of murder. We look forward to you joining us next week on Truth is Justice as we continue to set the record straight.